Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Whitfield said about Elena Martinez on her first night shift at Sacred Heart, 15 months ago. He didn't know she'd spent 12 years in the Special Forces. He didn't know her hands had held together soldiers bleeding out in Mosul. He certainly didn't know that the woman folding gauze in the supply room at 2:47 a.m. was a Master Chief Petty Officer running a classified FBI JSOC surveillance operation from his own hospital. What he saw was a quiet woman with soft hands who deferred to authority. What he didn't see would cost him everything. The ICU corridors at Sacred Heart hum with fluorescent precision, the kind of sterile white light that flattens everything into the same emotional register. Atlanta humidity presses against the loading dock doors, but inside, the air is all antiseptic and recycled breath. Elena Martinez moves through bed 847 to bed 852 like water finding its level, her movements economical and certain. 15 months on night shift. 51 weeks without a single error on her record. The other nurses don't know why she's so good, they just know that when Elena suggests something about pain management or wound care, you listen. It's not a request. It's the kind of authority that doesn't need a voice. She favors her left leg slightly, weight shifting to avoid pressure on an injury she's never mentioned. No one asks. In a hospital, people have their reasons for limping. She wears her scrubs crisp despite the pre-dawn exhaustion that should make everyone's clothes stick to their skin like they've been swimming. She checks the exit routes before sitting down in the break room. She touches the trauma shears in her pocket every 30 seconds when the hall's empty, fingers finding the engraved call sign along the handle like prayer beads. The shears are industrial grade, worn from actual use, not the stainless steel props that hang from other nurses' belts. These have been through something. The assignment is routine, monitor bed 847, foreign national, 3 weeks post-op, standard recovery trajectory. Except his not standard. Except Elena's small notebook, the one she never leaves at the nurse's station, tracks his visitor log with military precision. Times. Names. Descriptions. The notebook stays in her locker, hidden beneath her spare scrubs. This is why she came to Sacred Heart. This is why she absorbed 15 months of night shifts and the isolation that comes with being too competent in a world that doesn't trust competence unless it's validated by a credential you bought rather than earned. Dr. Whitfield arrives for his rotation at 11 p.m., and the temperature in the hallway changes. Not because he's loud, he isn't. He's too polished for volume. He's the kind of dangerous that wears a $3,000 watch and a last name that opens doors in Atlanta the way a key opens houses. Whitfield. Old money. Better connections. A brother-in-law on the hospital board. A sister married to a city council man. The kind of privilege that doesn't need competence to survive. He's tall in the way men grow tall when no one ever tells them they're wrong. His presence moves through the hospital like a yacht through still water, displacing everything simply by existing. He pauses in the supply room doorway, watching Elena fold gauze. Not the way ordinary people fold gauze. The way someone trained to prepare field dressings in 30 seconds folds gauze. The corners are military precise. Her hands move with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something 10,000 times under pressure. Her fingers know the exact fold without thinking. That's when Whitfield sees it, not competence, but the specific flavor of competence that comes from somewhere other than a nursing degree program and hospital rotations. It's the muscle memory of someone who has prepared bandages while bullets came through windows. The kind of hands that have pressure-dressed ephemeral bleed in the dark. He feels something he doesn't have a name for. Something like standing in the shadow of something bigger than himself. The moment passes. Whitfield moves into the ICU, and Elena finishes the gauze without acknowledging him. By 1 a.m., it's impossible to ignore. The charge nurse, a woman named Keisha with 15 years of experience and a degree that's never questioned, mentions that the post-op patient in 847 is reporting pain. Keisha frames it as a question. To Elena, it's already a decision. She walks into 847 and observes for 90 seconds without touching anything. The patient's facial tension. His breathing pattern. The way his fingers grip the blanket. She notes the foreplacement, the medication schedule, the timing of his last pain dose. His left side, Elena says quietly. The drain is putting pressure on tissue that's still healing. Pain isn't infection, it's positioning. She moves to the bed. May I? The patient nods. Elena adjusts him with movements that have no wasted motion, supporting his weight while the drain tube shifts. She explains what she's doing in a voice that sounds like still water. Your body's expecting pressure here. You got used to it. When it shifts, your nervous system reads it as injury. It's not. Try resting this way for 15 minutes. She sets a timer on her phone. She doesn't leave. She documents the exact drain position, the exact angle of the bed, notes for continuity of care. By 1:47 a.m., the patient's pain is down 40%. By 2:15 a.m., Keisha is telling the resident that Elena just solved a problem he was about to address with medications they didn't need. The resident, a first year who respects actual competence, nods and says something he shouldn't. She knows more than half the staff here. Whitfield hears about it through the hospital's invisible networks. The way news travels in institutions, never through official channels, always through the spaces between. The nurses' station gossip. The resident lounge talk. The way his status as senior physician starts feeling less secure when there's a night shift nurse solving problems his attending physicians miss. By his third observation shift watching Elena work, Whitfield understands what he's facing. She has none of his credentials. None of his pedigree. No family name that carries weight in Atlanta. No board connections. No golf games with administrators. She has something else. Something worse. She has the kind of competence that makes competence itself look like the most dangerous qualification in any room. She commands respect from people who have no institutional reason to respect her. The charge nurses listen because she's right. The residents listen because she catches things they miss. The patients listen because she has the kind of calm that comes from having survived situations where panic kills people. Whitfield starts reviewing her file in the administrative database. 15 months with Sacred Heart. Before that, a gap of 3 years with almost no employment history. No social media presence. No personal details. No references to family. No photos from nursing school. Her employment application lists military service under prior experience with a single date, 2012 to 2024. 12 years. Rank listed as Master Chief Petty Officer. No explanation of what that means. No details. No anything. He searches her name through the hospital's internal system and finds almost nothing. She's a ghost with credentials. This is when the decision hardens inside him. This is when Dr. Whitfield looks at Elena Martinez, truly looks at her, and sees not a nurse but a threat. Not because she's competent. Because her competence exposes something he's been hiding from himself for 15 years, that he bought his position in ways that make it fragile. That every connection he leveraged to climb would crumble if someone like Elena, someone with actual skills that didn't require politics to acquire, started asking questions about why decisions were made the way they were. He needs her gone. Not demoted. Not transferred. Gone. Erased from Sacred Heart before she exposes something that takes down more than just his reputation. Before she makes the hospital administration question why they're paying him when they could have her for half the salary doing twice the work. The hospital's 7 a.m. fluorescent lights flicker on schedule, and Elena finishes her shift charting. 12 hours of work with no errors. 12 hours of invisible excellence. She passes Whitfield in the hallway, and he's looking at her the way wolves look at prey that doesn't know it's being hunted yet. She meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, not long enough to be defiant, short enough to seem submissive. She has no idea what she just triggered. No way of knowing that the 15-month quiet period is about to end. No way of knowing that Dr. Whitfield has already started making phone calls to people who can help him dismantle her without leaving fingerprints. She touches her trauma shears one more time, the metal warm from her pocket. She has no idea this touch, this small habit that means something to her, is about to become the most important piece of evidence in a battle she doesn't yet realize she's fighting. The wound debridement started like any other post-surgical cleanup, Elena pushing the sterile cart into room 623 where Mrs. Chen's elderly mother sat in the visitor's chair, her papery hands folded over a rosary. The patient's son, Master Sergeant Chen, lay propped at 45 degrees, his Humvee accident healing in neat surgical lines. Elena had already reviewed his chart twice, noted the lacerations, planned the irrigation sequence. She was 3 sentences into explaining the tissue assessment when Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway without knocking. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, letting the silence accumulate like pressure in a closed room. "Ms. Martinez," he said, voice pitched for the family's benefit. "A word about your limited training." Elena's hand stilled over the sterile field. She didn't look up. She counted her breath, in for 4, hold for 4, while Whitfield turned to the elderly woman with an expression that looked like concern but moved like a knife. "I apologize," he continued, that smile in his voice now. "Our nurse here didn't attend a top-tier program, so sometimes the finer points of post-surgical care escape her." Let me clarify what she meant to say. The mother's face shifted. Trust evaporating like morning dew under a sun that suddenly felt hostile. Elena straightened. Set down her forceps with the deliberate care of someone placing down a weapon. She turned to face him, and in that moment, just that one moment, something flickered across her features. Not anger. Not fear. Something older. Something that had survived harder things than this. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking his gaze, her hand moving with surgical precision. The silence in the room went so thick you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breathing, the soft hiss of oxygen moving through tubing, the barely audible beep of the monitor marking time. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, calm, measured, with the weight of something that had been tested and found unbreakable. "I've survived worse scrutiny than your insecurity, Doctor." The words hung there. Mrs. Chen's grandmother made a small sound, maybe shock, maybe recognition. Master Sergeant Chen's vital signs jumped, his heart rate climbing from 84 to 92, but Elena was already turning back to the sterile field, her movements resuming with mechanical precision. Anchor. Assess. Angle. Advance. The rhythm was hypnotic, professional, bulletproof. Whitfield's smile froze for exactly 2 seconds before he recovered, backing out of the room with the swagger of someone who believed he'd won because he'd had the last position. But he hadn't. Elena had given him nothing, no trembling, no averted eyes, no retreat. She delivered a sentence that would follow him through every hallway in Sacred Heart like a ghost that asked uncomfortable questions. The isolation began the next morning. Elena sat in the break room during her 15-minute window, her coffee steaming in the standard hospital mug, the kind that never stayed hot, and watched the room empty. A resident remembered an urgent chart. A tech suddenly needed supplies from the storage closet. A nurse she'd helped through a difficult start last week looked directly past her like Elena had become furniture. By the second day, the pattern was so complete it felt choreographed. Someone would enter, see her there, and their body language would shift from relaxed to hunting for an exit in the span of a heartbeat. By day 3, the hallways had started to feel like a minefield where she was both the mine and the person walking toward it. She'd stop at the nurse's station to update a chart and conversations would die mid-sentence. Staff members would avert their eyes with the kind of intensity usually reserved for someone contagious. Her badge swipes to the ICU started triggering secondary authentication requests, random system checks that added 4, sometimes 5 minutes to every entry. She could feel Whitfield watching from his office, observing the isolation like a gardener tending carefully to something poisonous. By Friday, he made it official. A formal write-up appeared on the unit board during shift change. Bold letters. Official formatting. The kind of documentation that created a paper trail. Medication error documentation, Elena Martinez with 3 separate incidents listed, a charting delay that never happened, a transcription error she hadn't made, a dose verification she'd actually triple-checked. Each one carried timestamps. Each one had witness signatures, collected through pressure, through favor calls, through the kind of institutional leverage that didn't require truth, just authorization. She read it once while staff pretended not to watch her read it. She didn't return to look again. Whitfield started calling her nurse participation trophies within earshot of the attending physicians, loud enough that 3 people could hear, soft enough that he could claim it was a private comment if challenged. Diversity hire, she caught him saying to a resident while she was checking vitals 10 feet away, his tone dripping with the kind of contempt reserved for people who'd received things they hadn't earned. She knew the resident could see her. She knew he was performing. She also knew that looking up, acknowledging it, proving that it landed, would give him exactly the reaction he was hunting for. So she didn't give it to him. Her charting remained immaculate. Her hand stayed steady on her patients. Her medication counts balanced to the decimal. But the system was working now, the way Whitfield had designed it. The isolation wasn't just social anymore. It was becoming institutional. Her access to the ICU was now getting flagged constantly, each secondary authentication adding minutes to her workflow, creating visible delays that made her look inefficient, unreliable. She could see Whitfield watching from his office window on the 3rd floor, could feel the satisfaction radiating from him like heat off asphalt. What he didn't know was that those ICU delays were giving her problems. Real problems. Her actual assignment, the foreign national in 847, admitted 2 weeks prior on paperwork that said extended care for surgical complications but really meant something else entirely, was someone she needed to photograph, to document, to track. Someone connected to a supply diversion operation that she'd spent the last 15 months establishing. The restricted access meant she was losing coverage windows. Missing opportunities. Watching her mission start to unravel because a mediocre doctor with better connections had decided to take her apart piece by institutional piece. 2 weeks into the siege, the universe sent her a complication with tactical awareness. Room 512, Army Ranger, 42 years old, recovering from a Humvee rollover in a training accident. Master Sergeant Chen. 3 muscle rotations. Lacerations on his left side requiring careful debridement. Elena was assigned to the wound care, which meant a 20-minute window with an operator who'd learned to read patterns the way she'd learned to read wounds. She set up the sterile field with the efficiency that came from doing this under fire, with helmets nearby and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with copper and fear. She didn't think about her technique. Technique became muscle memory only after enough representatives under pressure, only after you'd done something so many times in the worst conditions imaginable that your hands moved without permission from your brain. Master Sergeant Chen watched her work and his vitals changed. She could see it on the monitor, his heart rate climbing from baseline 80 to 92, his breathing pattern shifting from resting to alert. He was reading her like she was reading him. Like they were both doing the same thing in a different language. "That's not nursing school," he said quietly. Elena didn't pause. Her hands continued their 4-count rhythm, the assessment of tissue planes, the decisions that kept everything functional when it wanted to fall apart. "That's a combat medic's technique," Chen continued. "I've seen it in Mosul." She was suddenly aware of every sound in the room. The ventilator's mechanical breathing. The monitor's soft beep. The scratch of sterile gloves against surgical field. The barely audible hiss of saline irrigation moving through damaged tissue. "I trained with good people," she said, keeping her voice neutral, keeping her hands moving. "No," Chen insisted. He was watching her with the intensity of someone reading classified documents. "That's muscle memory. That's representatives under pressure." "What unit?" Elena finished the dressing. Her trauma shears came out of her pocket, the weight, the wear pattern, the way her thumb found the handle without looking. She caught him seeing the shears, caught him registering something about them. The cut. The balance. The little detail that only mattered if you knew what to look for. "That's not hospital issue," he said. She met his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough that he could see the operator behind the scrubs, the person who'd carried heavier things than clipboards, the Master Chief Petty Officer standing in front of him pretending to be just a nurse. She didn't answer. The silence was its own language. "Rest, Sergeant," she said, finishing the dressing with one final secure wrap. "Your daughter's visiting tomorrow." She left before he could ask anything else. Her heart wasn't accelerated. Her hands weren't shaking. But something had shifted. Someone had seen her. And in an operation built on invisibility, on being overlooked, on using underestimation as a weapon, being seen was either the best or worst thing that could happen. She didn't have time to figure out which. 3 nights later, room 701 went quiet in the way that meant everything was about to get loud. Elena was charting at the nurse's station when the monitor alarm cut through the unit's hum, a sustained, accusatory wail that sent every spine straight. The screen showed room 701's oxygen saturation cascading downward like a stone through dark water. 92. 88. 81. The arterial line traced a mountain range that was flattening into a line. She moved before the charge nurse finished saying the words. The ICU corridor stretched before her like a runway. Her shoes made no sound on the tile, muscle memory from a different kind of night, under different stars, where the smallest sound meant the difference between breathing and not. The door to 701 was already open. A post-surgical patient, cardiac repair, 3 days out, was propped upright in the bed, eyes wide, pulling air that wasn't coming, his neck muscles working like he was swallowing stones. Tracheal edema. Elena knew the sight. Swelling from the intubation tube, except this swelling was progressing faster than the textbooks said it should. His oxygen sat was already at 74. The code button had been called. The anesthesiologist was 7 minutes out from the surgical floor. This patient had maybe 4 before his airway collapsed entirely. She looked at the monitor. The clock in her head that had never been wrong in 14 years of combat zones and field hospitals and dark tents lit only by chemical glow sticks told her exactly what she needed to know. 1 intravenous access wouldn't buy time. Oral intubation was already off the table, the swelling blocked the airway. He needed a surgical airway. Now. Elena's trauma shears were in her scrub pocket, the ones with Reaper engraved so finely along the handle that only someone looking for it would see the letters at all. She'd carried them since Mosul. Never needed them here. Never should have needed them here. The patient's eyes locked on hers. That look, the one that said he understood what was about to happen, that he was terrified, that he was trusting her anyway. She'd seen that look on soldiers under fire, on civilians caught between factions, on the dying who had no one else. She prepped the surgical field with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in a Humvee rolling across Anbar province with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. Iodine solution. Sterile drape. Her hands steady as instruments. The skin of his neck was pale, the muscles taut with the effort of trying to breathe. She palpated the landmarks, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the membrane between them where the airway was narrowest and most accessible. Her fingers knew this anatomy the way a musician knows their instrument. The shears opened in her hand. The first incision was vertical, decisive, through skin and subcutaneous tissue. Blood welled. She didn't hesitate. The second incision was horizontal, through the cricothyroid membrane. The hiss of air escaping, that sound would replay in her head for weeks, that gasping release as pressure equalized. She inserted the airway adjunct with hands that had done this 100 times, in conditions infinitely worse. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed. 85. 91. 98. The color returned to his face. The frantic grip he had on the bed rail loosened. His breathing steadied into something that resembled human rhythm. The code team arrived at 2:52 in the morning. 12 minutes later. The patient was already stable, already oxygenating, already asking what happened through the temporary airway Elena had given him. Dr. Whitfield appeared at 2:57, moving through the doorway with the slow precision of a man surveying a crime scene. His eyes traced the blood on Elena's gloves, the surgical instruments on the bedside table, the patient whose crisis had been resolved without his presence. His jaw tightened in a way that made every nerve in the room go quiet. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't thank Elena. He didn't acknowledge her at all. He simply examined the patient with movements that felt like cataloging evidence, then turned and walked back down the corridor. Elena cleaned her hands at the sink in room 701. The blood ran pink, then clear. The emergency had compressed into 12 minutes, and now there was only the aftermath, the paperwork, the report, the documentation that would be read by people who understood exactly what she'd done and exactly what it meant. Her phone buzzed at 6:32 in the morning, in the locker room as she was changing out of her scrubs. A text from an FBI handler whose name appeared in her phone as Chen's cardiologist. What happened to your access? Elena stared at the message. Her ICU assignment had been her cover, her ticket to the surveillance rotation that monitored the foreign national in bed 847. The patient with the diplomatic immunity and the suspicious financial transfers and the connections to supply chains that didn't trace to legitimate sources. The 2-year operation that had been building toward something. The reason she'd swallowed a civilian identity and buried Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez under 15 months of night shifts and deferential silences. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't create a record. By noon, the restrictions had been formalized. An email from administration, copied to 7 people, informing Elena that she was barred from ICU access pending review of the emergency procedure. By 1 o'clock, her shift schedule was restructured. Her regular patients had been reassigned. The continuity of care that she built with 4 patients, one recovering from a stroke, another from pneumonia, had been fragmented intentionally. Not carelessness. Calculation. Dr. Whitfield's morning squash game was with the board's vice chair. It happened on Thursdays, reliably, at the athletic club 3 blocks from Sacred Heart. The conversation that happened there, in the locker room between the court and the showers, moved through phone lines to administration by 2 o'clock that afternoon. The message was simple and devastating: rogue nursing staff, practicing medicine without a license, endangering patients, cowboy mentality, inadequate supervision, liability exposure. By 4 o'clock, Elena's access badge had been reprogrammed. The ICU scanner would reject her. The door would not open. She sat in the break room at 5:30, eating nothing, drinking nothing, her hands folded in her lap. A resident passed through and didn't meet her eyes. A nurse Elena had helped train with ventilator protocols suddenly remembered an urgent call. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their persistent, anxious hum, and within seconds, 3 staff members who'd been sitting nearby found reasons to leave. The isolation was practiced. The shunning was systematic. Every interaction had been weaponized. Her FBI handler texted again at 6, "Operation is exposed. You're blown. When can you exfil? Exfil. Extract. Leave. Walk away from the hospital, from the cover, from the surveillance target who was still upstairs in the ICU, still connected to networks they hadn't fully mapped yet. 2 years. All of it collapsing because Elena had done the only thing she could do. She had saved a patient's life, and in doing so, she had revealed the precision of her training. Room 512 was where the ranger was. The one who'd recognized her technique, whose eyes had gone knowing and quiet when he watched her hands move. He was being discharged tomorrow afternoon, and when he left, he would carry with him the certainty that he'd just spent 3 days recovering in a room guarded by someone he understood in ways the hospital staff never would. That kind of knowledge, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Elena finished her shift at 7 in the morning. She clocked out at 7:03. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She walked through the emergency department exit, and the Atlanta heat hit her like a wall, like punishment, like the first honest breath she'd taken in 15 months. Behind her, in Sacred Heart Surveillance Center, her movement was being tracked. Not by the FBI. Not by the operation anymore. By the hospital security system, which Dr. Whitfield had just requested access to review, in light of the nursing staff irregularities. The walls were closing. But not yet closed. That was what made the moment so dangerous. That was what made the silence that followed so thick you could cut it with her trauma shears. 3 nights later at 2:47 in the morning, room 701 crashed. The monitor screamed. Elena heard it before anyone else because she was checking vitals on the post-surgical patient 2 doors down, and when a cardiac monitor hits that pitch, your nervous system recognizes it as the sound of a body betraying itself. She moved. The patient, a construction worker 36 hours out from elective spinal fusion, had his eyes wide open, gasping like a fish on concrete. His oxygen saturation was already dropping. 68. 65. 62. Not hypoxia from hemorrhage. The breath sounds were uneven. The right side of his chest was silent. Tracheal edema. Post-surgical swelling compressing his airway from the inside, and nobody had caught it on rounds because nobody was looking hard enough. The resident on call was in the call room. Dr. Whitfield was unreachable. His phone went to voicemail twice, 3 times, and there was maybe 4 minutes before this man's oxygen saturation hit 40 and his heart decided to stop entirely. Elena didn't call for help. She was already moving toward the supply cart, her hand steady as a surgical laser, pulling the trauma shears from her pocket. The ones with Reaper engraved so subtly along the handle that only she would ever see it. Only she would ever know what those letters meant. The patient's eyes locked on hers and she saw the recognition flicker there, not of her identity, but of competence. Of someone who'd done this before. "I'm going to help you breathe," she said. Her voice was still water. "This will hurt for 5 seconds. Then it won't." The cricothyroid membrane was right where it should be, between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid, the small depression at the base of his neck where airway meets anatomy. She palpated once, marked the spot with her fingertip, and made the incision. The blade went through tissue and cartilage like it had muscle memory, because it did. Her hands moved on their own. The hiss of air escaping. The tube going in. Her fingers stabilizing it while someone, a night nurse finally appearing in the doorway, was already on the radio calling for anesthesia. 60 seconds. The patient's chest began to rise again. The monitor showed oxygen climbing. 72. 78. 84. Stable. The code team arrived in 90 seconds, took over the airway with professional precision, had him intubated properly and transferred to ICU within 4 minutes of her initial incision. The patient would live. His brain would not be a cauliflower. His family would not be identifying a body in the morning. Elena stood in the hallway outside room 701, peeling off the gloves, and watched Dr. Whitfield arrive, 12 minutes late, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair still damp from somewhere he'd been that wasn't the hospital. He assessed the situation in 30 seconds. He saw the cricothyrotomy. He saw the trauma shears on the supply cart. He saw Elena's face, calm as stone, and he understood in that moment that he had just been outclassed in front of every staff member on night shift. The room went dead silent. That silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and Dr. Whitfield's jaw tightened into a line that looked like scar tissue. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The retaliation began before shift change. By 7 in the morning, Elena's schedule had been stripped and rearranged, her ICU rotations terminated, her regular patients reassigned to other nurses, continuity of care fractured like glass. By 8 o'clock, her access badge stopped working on the ICU wing door. The foreign national in bed 847, the linchpin of the entire FBI JSOC operation she'd been running for 2 years, the target she was supposed to cultivate and document and prepare for federal seizure, was now behind a door she couldn't access. By 8:30, Whitfield had called the board's vice chair during his morning squash game. Elena knew because the vice chair appeared on the unit by 9, his face carefully arranged into the expression of someone delivering necessary consequences. The allegation was elegant in its construction, unauthorized practice of medicine without a license, endangering patient welfare, violating hospital protocol, operating outside her scope of practice, performing a procedure that required physician certification, endangering lives through presumption. Everything technically accurate. Everything morally inverted. Everything designed to make her look like a rogue operator instead of someone who'd kept a man alive when every protocol said he should be dead. By 10 o'clock, Whitfield requested her presence in human resources. The room was small. The HR representative was a woman named Dawson who'd never made eye contact with Elena in 15 months of shift overlap. The unit director sat against the far wall, his posture the shape of a man who'd already been convinced. Whitfield held a single sheet of paper. "Your personal effects by end of shift," he said, and he was already turning back to his computer before the words finished leaving his mouth. Not fired. Not discussed. Not given a chance to explain why a patient would have been dead without the decision she made. Just removed. Surgical. Strategic. The kind of precision that showed her exactly how thoroughly he'd thought this through, how completely he'd insulated himself against any challenge. Elena didn't speak. What was there to say? She couldn't defend herself by revealing that her nursing credential was cover. That her real employment was federal. That the operation she'd been running was authorized at levels Whitfield couldn't even imagine. That the supply diversion ring she was tracking had 53 names on it, and his cooperation with that ring, either willing or unwitting, was about to be discovered. She couldn't say any of that because saying it would burn the entire operation, would sacrifice the 2 years of work and the dozen agents embedded in that supply chain, would confirm to every bureaucrat at the FBI and JSOC that cover identities weren't actually secure. So she stood up. She walked out of that office. She removed her badge from her pocket and set it on the break room counter where every staff member could see it. The note that Whitfield had already posted about her unauthorized procedures was still on the unit board. No one had removed it. No one would remove it. By the time day shift started, a decorated combat veteran who'd saved lives in Mosul would be a cautionary tale about overstepping, about knowing her place, about what happens when a nurse tries to play doctor. She walked the corridors one last time. The staff members who'd worked beside her for 15 months suddenly became very interested in their phones. A resident looked directly at her and turned the opposite direction. The patient in bed 516, the one whose blood clot she'd caught before it killed him, was being discharged today, and when he asked 3 different staff members where Elena was, they told him they didn't know. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. By dawn, Elena was in the hospital laundry room. Industrial washers churned in rhythm, their mechanical pulse like a heartbeat that had nothing to do with her. Steam rose from the heated dryers, thick and white, carrying the mineral-sharp smell of industrial bleach and the ghost of 1,000 uniforms that had been cleaned in this basement room. She folded her scrubs with the same precision she'd once used for her dress uniform. Each crease exact. Each fold measured. Navy blue fabric becoming smaller and smaller, the uniform that had been her cover, her mission, her purpose for 15 months at Sacred Heart, reduced to a neat stack on a wire shelf. The surgical gloves she'd worn were in the trash bin. The trauma shears she'd used to save a man's life were in her pocket. She touched them once, just once, feeling the slight weight of the engraved call sign against her palm. A laundry worker, a man with grey threading through his beard, pretended not to see her. Pretended not to notice that the decorated combat veteran who'd been walking these halls with purpose was now folding her own termination notice into cloth. Her phone buzzed at 6:14 in the morning. A text from her handler at the FBI, operation closed. Jurisdiction transferred. The message carried 2 years of work in 4 words. The supply diversion would continue untracked. The foreign national in bed 847 would remain unobserved. The 53 names on the supply chain roster would continue operating while federal attention pivoted elsewhere. 2 years. Hundreds of hours. A cover identity blown across 15 months of 15-hour shifts. Gone. Outside the loading dock, Whitfield's Mercedes pulled into his reserved spot. Fresh paint on the curb. His name in white letters, sharp and clean, Whitfield. Reserved. Permanent. He stepped out of the car with his suit jacket already unbuttoned, already thinking about the day ahead, already certain that he'd handled the threat to his position with surgical precision. He didn't see Elena watching from inside the loading dock door, didn't register the quiet dignity that remained in her spine even in defeat. Didn't understand that what he'd just done wasn't end a problem. What he'd done was light a fuse with a countdown he couldn't measure. 48 hours after Elena folded her scrubs for what she thought was the last time, Master Sergeant Chen walked back through Sacred Heart's emergency doors. His uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut glass. His bearing had the weight of someone who'd carried wounded men across burning sand, and he was looking for one specific nurse. Security tried stopping him at the desk. Protocol. Visitors weren't permitted beyond the main corridor without clearance. The guard, a man named Rodriguez who'd been dismissive to Elena on her final shift, placed a hand on Chen's shoulder. It was a mistake. Chen didn't move, didn't tense, didn't threaten. He simply showed his commander's credentials, and his voice dropped to something that sounded like a helicopter landing in a confined space. "I need Elena Martinez." "We don't have anyone by that," Rodriguez began. "Yesterday. Night shift. You watched her leave." Chen's jaw tightened. "Get her supervisor. Now." Rodriguez made a phone call. Within 6 minutes, 3 administrators were walking Chen toward the hospital conference room on the 3rd floor. 2 of them, the vice chair of the medical board and the chief of nursing, looked like they were walking toward their own execution. They knew what had happened. They'd signed off on the termination. They'd accepted Dr. Whitfield's narrative without questioning it, which meant they'd participated in something that was about to blow apart. Chen sat at the head of the mahogany table. He didn't wait for anyone to speak first. "Where is she?" "Master Sergeant, if you could explain," the administrator began. "Elena Martinez was terminated yesterday on charges of practicing medicine without a license. For performing a cricothyrotomy on a patient in acute respiratory distress while your senior physician was unreachable. That patient's name was on your discharge logs this morning. Breathing. Walking. Asking for her specifically." Chen leaned forward. "So I'm asking again. Where is she?" The hospital administrator's face had gone the color of old gauze. "Sir, we can't disclose employee information." The conference room door opened. Elena stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a rain jacket, her hair pulled back in a military-precise braid. Rodriguez had found her at home, had called the number listed in her file, had said only that someone important was asking about her. She'd known, with the clarity that comes from 20 years of crisis, that important meant federal. Chen stood. His dress white seemed to occupy all the available light in the room. He looked at Elena across the table, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition of someone who'd operated in the same darkness, carried the same weight. "Master Chief Petty Officer Martinez." The administrator's head turned toward Elena so fast you could hear his neck crack. "You're what?" Elena's voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of truth being stated as fact, classified until right now, apparently. What happened over the next 4 hours in that conference room would later be described in federal testimony as a systematic revelation of previously withheld information of significant national security and criminal import. What it actually was, the careful dismantling of every lie that had been told about Elena Martinez. First came the young woman in navy dress whites who walked through the door with a file folder and the bearing of someone who'd grown up watching her father bleed into the sand. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the Master Sergeant's daughter, placed the folder on the table and read aloud from a declassified intelligence summary. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, not from emotion, but from rage held at military precision. Silver Star, first citation, Valor and Courage in Combat Medical Operations, Mosul Province, 2009. Extracted 3 wounded combatants under sustained small arms fire, established casualty collection point, and maintained airway management for 2 hours until medevac arrived. She turned the page. Silver Star, second citation, Valor and Courage in Emergency Tactical Medicine, Mosul Province, 2011. Provided emergency surgical intervention under fire, saved the lives of 4 coalition forces, and continued providing medical support while under active engagement. The pediatric nurse from the night shift, the one who'd been pressured into signing the false write-up, came in next and sat down slowly, as if moving through water. Her hand shook as she opened a second file. When she began reading, her voice cracked on every name: Navy Cross, highest military decoration for valor, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez led a medical evacuation from an active combat zone in Mosul, extracting 12 wounded personnel while maintaining suppressive fire, providing en route trauma medicine, and establishing triage protocols under sustained hostile fire for 47 minutes until the final evacuation bird cleared the landing zone. The nurse looked directly at Dr. Whitfield's empty chair. "You made me sign papers saying she was incompetent. You made me lie about a person who was decorated for saving lives." A SEAL team leader in dress blues appeared next, Command Senior Chief Marcus Halloway, whose presence seemed to reduce the room's available oxygen. He didn't read from papers. He simply sat down and spoke in the kind of voice that had once commanded men through hell. "I served with her in Mosul. I watched her work. I watched her make decisions in 60 seconds that took the rest of us 6 months to fully understand." The citation doesn't capture that she was moving medical supplies against orders because she knew which forward operating base was going to get hit based on patterns nobody else could see, or that she saved my life personally by recognizing internal bleeding symptoms that 2 trauma surgeons had initially missed. The military doesn't give Navy Crosses to incompetent people. Then came the FBI agents. 2 of them, federal credentials gleaming like they'd been polished specifically for this moment. The lead agent, a woman named Torres with the kind of controlled fury that only comes from having tracked financial crimes for 16 years, opened her laptop and projected supply chain data across the conference room walls. 3 years ago, the FBI, in conjunction with Naval Special Operations Command, initiated an investigation into the diversion of military medical supplies to black market channels with suspected ties to irregular arms dealers. We inserted an operative into Sacred Heart Hospital's night shift nursing roster. That operative was Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. The administrator's face had moved past pale into something closer to translucent. She was 3 weeks away from establishing the final connection between our hospital and the supply diversion network when her supervisor, Dr. Whitfield, demanded an investigation into her unauthorized medical procedures and had her terminated, which compromised an active federal operation. Agent Torres pulled up a spreadsheet. 47 irregular purchase orders. Equipment quantities that didn't match surgical logs. Routing numbers traced through 3 shell companies. All of them signed by Dr. Whitfield. We got the break we needed when we pulled 3 years of supply chain records. Dr. Whitfield wasn't just negligent. He wasn't just overlooking diversion. He was orchestrating it. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. But something in the room's pressure altered, the kind of atmospheric change that happens when a door is opened to a larger truth. The equipment was being funneled to Marcus Whitfield Medical Supply LLC, Torres continued, a shell company registered in Delaware and ultimately owned by Dr. Whitfield's brother-in-law. Over 36 months, approximately $847,000 in federal property made the journey from Sacred Heart's inventory to resale through channels we're still mapping. The investigation Whitfield demanded into Elena Martinez's rogue procedures became the investigative pathway that exposed his entire operation. Federal auditors descended on Sacred Heart within 72 hours. They moved like ghosts through supply rooms and inventory systems, pulling records that would have gone unnoticed if anyone had been actually searching for what they were looking for. But they knew what to find. They knew the pattern. They knew that Whitfield's signature appeared on every single irregular order, that his financial records showed quarterly deposits from the shell company, that his personal assets, the house in Buckhead, the boat at Lake Lanny, the vintage car collection, had been purchased during the exact months when equipment diversions had peaked. Dr. Whitfield's medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation by midday Thursday. Federal charges followed: healthcare fraud, theft of government property, conspiracy to defraud the United States. His expensive lawyers negotiated a plea deal that was, by any objective measure, a mercy. Prison time in exchange for a guilty plea. Restitution payments structured over 10 years. and one condition that his attorneys fought for weeks before accepting: community service driving a medical supply van for Sacred Heart's logistics department. 32 hours per month for 2 years. The same hospital where he'd built his reputation on the backs of people he'd systematically dismantled. The same loading dock where Elena had folded her scrubs in defeat just 96 hours earlier. They cleared out his office on a Friday morning. The movers took his diplomas first, the ones from institutions he'd purchased with money and connections rather than excellence. The framed photos came down. The furniture that had been selected specifically to intimidate residents and nurses went into boxes. By noon, the space was empty except for the rectangle of slightly different paint where his nameplate had hung for 7 years. His parking space got fresh asphalt that afternoon. New paint, bright white, with fresh lettering, veteran parking only. A small plaque beneath it read, dedicated to those who served. In honor of Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, United States Navy. Elena was reinstated with full back pay. The formal apology came typed on hospital letterhead and signed by the board chair, though what words could possibly capture it, what language could exist that was adequate to the magnitude of the institutional failure? The pediatric nurse who'd been pressured into signing false documentation received immunity in exchange for testimony. The residents Whitfield had mentored began filing complaints they'd been too afraid to voice while he held power. The silence he'd created through systematic intimidation became permission for others to speak. 6 months later, Sacred Heart unveiled the Martinez Trauma Center on the 4th floor, a specialized unit for combat veteran care and trauma medicine training, funded partially by a grant from the Navy's Expeditionary Medical Support Command. The dedication ceremony happened on a morning in May when the rain had finally stopped and the air carried that particular freshness that comes after storms have passed. Elena stood at the unveiling in Navy medical officer's fatigues, her uniform crisp as a weapon. Her trauma shears were displayed in a shadow box mounted on the wall of the new unit's main corridor, the shears with Reaper engraved subtly along the handle, now visible, now explained. The placard beside them read, in recognition of Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, Medical Valor Under Fire. Below that, a museum-style caption detailed her 2 silver stars, her Navy Cross, and her service record dating back to 2003. Master Sergeant Chen attended the ceremony alongside his daughter Sarah, both in dress whites, both standing with the particular posture of people who knew exactly what Elena's kind of quiet cost. A delegation of service members she'd treated over 2 deployments filled the front rows, soldiers and sailors whose names would never appear in news stories, whose lives continued ordinary because she'd made extraordinary choices in moments when nobody was watching. The hospital board's new chair, a former healthcare compliance officer who'd spent 3 months auditing every decision made under the previous administration, acknowledged the injustice publicly. She announced a partnership with the FBI for ongoing ethics training. She introduced new policies that made it impossible for someone like Whitfield to operate in the shadows. And she stood directly in front of Elena, saluted her, a civilian saluting a military officer, and said only, "Thank you for your service to this hospital and your country." In the parking lot that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed and the rain started again, Elena watched a medical supply van pull into the loading dock. She recognized it by the routing number on the side. She recognized it because she'd spent for hours being debriefed about every interaction with Whitfield, and his new position had been detailed as part of his restitution agreement. The driver cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, windshield wipers beating against the rain. Then he looked up, and through the wet glass, his eyes met Elena's for 1 second. His face had aged in 6 months, not just in time but in recognition, the hollow acknowledgement of someone who'd destroyed himself trying to destroy someone better. He looked away first. Elena didn't move. She didn't acknowledge him. She turned back toward the Martinez Trauma Center, where a new class of combat medics was waiting for her teaching session. The hospital chapel's bells were ringing, 3 o'clock, shift change time, the rhythm of the place reasserting itself. Behind her, Whitfield climbed down from the van and began unloading boxes of equipment for the new trauma unit. The work was honest. The work was necessary. The work was all that remained. That evening, Elena stood in the trauma center's main teaching space with a group of 12 medical students and 4 active duty corpsmen. The trauma shears rested on the demonstration table in front of her, their engraving catching the light. She looked at each of them in turn, the young faces, the ones who were still learning that excellence costs something, that integrity under pressure is the only kind that matters. The measure of a medical professional, Elena said, and her voice carried the weight of truth earned through fire, isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when the lights go out. That's where you find out what you're really made of. That's where you discover if you're the kind of person who'll compromise for comfort, or the kind who'll stand in the dark and do what's right anyway. Choose carefully. The person you become in that darkness is the person you'll be for the rest of your life. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If Elena's story resonates with you, if you've ever stood alone against institutional pressure, if you've ever maintained your integrity when it would have been easier to break, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below with your own story of standing firm when it mattered most. Because these stories need to be told, and the people who live them need to know they're not alone.